So what can you tell me about the Czech Pale Lager, or category 3A, if we're getting nerdy with the BJCP or the Cicerone? What does a Czech Pale Lager taste like? What kind of food goes with it? What's maybe a little bit of its history? What other styles is it similar to? What are some good examples to try? Well, we're going to talk about all of that today, and we're going to use this example here from the Czech Republic to help us do that. Here we go. Enjoy. Hi, welcome. My name is George Thornton. I'm an advanced Cicerone and a BJCP judge and a beer guide travel nerd. And today we're going to talk about the Czech Pale Lager style, which is category 3A from the BJCP. We're going to talk about the history of the style, the flavor, descriptions, aroma, etc. And also talk a little about food pairings that might go well with it, maybe some examples to look for so you can try them. And we'll go over some of the technical aspects as well. And so the example that we have today is from a brewery called Pivovar Hostomice. It is just outside of Prague in the Czech Republic. And the example we have here is called the Fabián10. And the style category that kind of fits into is Světlý lečák, which basically means like light beer or like light draft version of a beer. And it's a whopping 3.5%, right in my wheelhouse. Every day, easy drinking, love it. And this style is actually the most consumed style in the Czech Republic. And it's essentially the little brother or little sister of the Czech Premium Pale Lager, which the more famous, well-known Pilsner Urquell fits into the category 3B, right above this. So, all right, I will try this beer for you. You're welcome. And I'll describe color, aroma, etc. And then we'll go over some of the BJCP kind of basic stuff, and I'll talk about some food pairings, etc., as mentioned. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe, all of that. And if you have anybody who's studying for Cicerone or BJCP, let them know that I'm here to help them. And if you're doing that I'm here to help you. Let me know which styles you'd like to go over. Of course, the goal is to go through all of them, but it helps to know maybe what you're working on. So here we go. Let's start with our appearance. Actually, I'm going to start with aroma because that's a good place to start. So on aroma, I'm going to need to talk about the hops, malt, yeast, and other, and I want to make sure I mark the intensity for each of those. So the first thing that's coming to my attention is really a pretty even balance between malt and hops. So, and also some little like yeast characteristics. So I'm just going to pick one place to start. Let's go with the malt. I get light or low, bready with breadcrumb or crust, and a little touch of very low caramel, and like dry hay or straw. So kind of like dry field, you know, if you're out on a hike or something, it's like in the summer and there's a field nearby and you get that dry grass. And that could be partially coming from the hops too, so let's talk about the hops. For hops, I'm getting a little touch of this like dried herbs de Provence or like dried herbs, a little bit of that dry grass characteristic could be coming from the hops as well. It's kind of, you know, maybe they're kind of mixing together there. And a low peppery. So overall, the malt impression is low and the hop impression is low as well, but just pushing a little bit more towards the hops. And then for yeast, I get a very low, like overripe apple, like red apple, so not acetaldehyde, not green apple or latex paint, but more of just the description of a very ripe, like the flesh of an apple. And so I would call that very low esters. And then this style is known for, or allowed to have a little touch of diacetyl. So I want to make sure I'm paying attention, looking for that. I would say a very, very low diacetyl. So very low kind of butter or like popcorn butter. And I want to say very, very low. And I tend to be very sensitive to this, so I feel like it would be easy for me to even, with my sensitivity, to not really notice it. So it's definitely sitting way in the background, which for this style, this is allowed. So if I was filling out a score sheet, I might say, you know, I would note it, but I wouldn't like take any points away from it. So let's go into the flavor. All right, so, you know, I was just talking about diacetyl, so I'm going to comment on it first, even though it's not the dominant characteristic in the flavor. but there is a very low diacetyl, very low buttery characteristic. It's funny that I'm talking about this because there's always these jokes. I feel like one of the main jokes about like anybody who's learning Cicerone or BJCP is that like now it's like every beer has butter or diacetyl. It's like as soon as you learn that thing, you know, like I gotta find it everywhere. So cuidado, careful. Don't be that person, I guess. But be that person also, because if it's there, it's there. And in this case, it's not a fault. It's just something I noticed, and it does provide a very low like slickness. So that's something I would comment on the mouthfeel. But as far as getting back to the flavor for this, there's a medium-low bitterness, a medium-low hoppy flavor that's like herbaceous and black pepper and like dried hay. And then there's a medium, or I'd say a low bready, very low caramel and very low bread crust sort of thing. And so that means the balance is leaning towards the hops. So when you first drink this beer, you probably won't think like intentionally or intently very much about like the, I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it. You may not notice right out the gate that, oh, this is a hop forward beer. So that's where being very clear about your intensities is really useful, especially for this style of beer. This is one of my favorite ones to teach people about the importance of intensities and sticking to, okay, the bitterness on this was medium low. The hop character was medium low. The malt is low. So if I'm using my intensities correctly, and that when I say low, I mean for all of the beers ever. I don't mean low for this style or low for my mood right now. I mean, I'm thinking about the intensity range for all beer out on the planet. This is low malt. So for all the potential of malt characteristic there could be for a beer, this is low. And so when I have that and I'm pretty clear on it and I practice that and I feel pretty confident about it, then it's easier for me to identify if this is a hop forward beer or a malt forward beer. Of course, there are some styles that are more yeast forward or adjunct forward, but that's a different video. And so we got the balance, we got hops, malts, and then yeast I need to comment on. I did comment on diacetyl, that's a byproduct of yeast fermentation, but let's look for maybe, I commented on apple before, so I want to make sure at least I'm looking for that and see if I get anything else. I still get that very low red apple, like ripe apple. Okay, so then I need to also comment on kind of the lingering sensation. So the lingering aspect is really more into, gosh, it has really all of it. Like you get a little bit of that like wave of diacetyl. So I have like the initial wave of like low, that maltiness and like this bitterness. And as soon as that kind of rounds out, then a little bit of diacetyl comes through, and then like the maltiness comes, and then I think the final thing that's lingering is really the bitterness. So it does kind of go through waves of kind of which ingredient is sort of kind of falling off the palate, and then the next ingredient sort of falls off the palate. But the lingering, or I should say the prevailing lingering sensation is really the bitterness. So again, that reminds me, okay, I'm drinking a hop forward beer. And when we're talking about style comparisons, or if this was in a blind tasting, etc., this information for me is like the key type of information to help me kind of pick what it is. Okay, so I touched on mouthfeel for a little bit when I talked about that slick sensation, but let's talk about the body and the carbonation. The body is like medium, and that might be aided a little bit by that like diacetyl slickness. And the carbonation, medium, maybe medium low. Like when I swish it, it doesn't really like, like kind of explode, but it does definitely have some carbonation in there, so it does help cleanse the palate quite a bit. And the astringency, and this is going to be hop-derived astringency, I would say is low, quite pleasant, very balanced, easy drinking. And then in terms of like alcohol warmth, none. And so that pretty much rounds out the entire BJCP, other than the color, right? So color or appearance overall. So I do have this just light gold. The clarity is, I have like little touches of like, this could be chill haze, but clarity is good. And the head is this just off-white, very persistent. I got some lacing kind of hanging out in the glass, but yeah, very nice, persistent, off-white, consistent head. Mostly consistent as far as like the structure of the bubbles. They're mostly got pretty tight bubble. There are some kind of smaller, like medium size bubbles as well. And that covers that. So let's now talk about the history of this beer style. It's a really fun beer style, and this which is the Czech Pale Lager, and the Czech Premium Pale Lager, which is just its bigger brother, are very similar in style, and their history is very intertwined. And they are, in my opinion, probably the most influential beer style of the past 200 years. I won't go too in depth, I guess, in this video, but that could be a really fun thing to do with the Pilsner Urquell, because that beer itself, that brand, Pilsner Urquell, is essentially one of the first iterations, or gets credit for being the first iteration of what we now call a Czech Pale Lager or a Czech Premium Pale Lager. And the short version of that is that we already had lagers, and they were already popular in southern Germany, especially, and Czech Republic. They're neighbors, very close. So we already had things like Märzen. We had the kind of Vienna style was kind of coming about, and we had styles like Bock, for instance. But the style Pilsner didn't exist, and actually this Pilsner is a way of saying like someone who's from the town of Pilsen. So in Czech, in the city of Pilsen, which is where Pilsner Urquell comes from. The story goes that basically the population is unsatisfied with the beer that's being produced, so they basically they literally kind of stage a protest, more or less, and they ask for basically the city ends up kind of building like a public brewery. And they hire a German brewer who was good at this lager style, which was already the popular style of the time. And he goes on a tour of Europe to kind of research, get inspiration, or espionage, I guess you could say. And part of this tour involves going up to England, where they were already making very pale beers that were like the pale ale style of England. And they were making very hoppy beers. And so he's somewhat inspired by this, but he's going to do this in a lager version. And so he uses the technology that was being used up in England to make very pale malts. It's this newer kilning technology that allowed the malt to be a very light color. And he basically pushes that technique even further, making an even lighter malt than what was being used in England. And this is now what we call Pilsner malt. And of course, the Pilsner malt is also the local malt that was available in the region around Pilsen. So he's taking these technologies from different areas and these practices. So in Germany, the lager style, especially in Munich, was already very popular. So he's using all of these, and he's kind of combining these together. And the kind of aggressive hopping techniques were not very well liked or preferred in southern Germany. It was more about showcasing very rich, delicate malt characteristics, and German beers still do that today. And so he kind of innovated by kind of combining multiple influences together, and gets credit for inventing the Pilsner style, which, if you have to define what the Pilsner style is, it's a hop-forward, light-colored lager, more or less. And the use of this amount of hops was not preferred in Germany. They preferred a more malt leaning. And so the Helles, which is a German style out of Munich, is basically the response to the consumer demand for this really cool, new, light, hoppy lager that's coming out of Pilsen. The German consumers want something that looks really light like that as well. And many of the German brewers aren't comfortable with, or just kind of refuse to make it as hoppy. So they basically take the same style, they take the same malting technique that Josef Groll over at Pilsner Urquell was using to make his very pale Czech pale lagers. And they apply that to German malts, but they don't allow the bitterness to be as high. And that's essentially what a Helles is. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I'm kind of wrapping myself, I'm kind of losing the thread a little bit, but it's just part of the story. That's one example of many of how the Czech Premium Pale Lager, or the Pilsner Urquell especially, became basically one of the most influential styles. I could go on and on and on. Kolsch changed the way it is because of Pilsner. Alt beer up in Germany changed the way it was. It just really marked this kind of revolution in making really light colored pale lagers. So that's a brief version of the history, but as far as comparing this style, which is just the Czech Pale Lager, to the Czech Premium Pale Lager, which is probably the more famous style because of Pilsner Urquell, fits in that category. The difference is really just, this is just a slightly lower version of that, less intense, lower alcohol. The alcohol range goes from 3% alcohol to 4.1% alcohol. The IBUs hover around the 20 to 25%, or 20 to 25 IBUs. I'll look this up and I'll put the exact numbers somewhere around here for you. SRM is in that 3 to 6 range. The finishing gravity is in like the 1.008 to 1.014, which to me tells me, just in that dry to off dry territory. And the starting gravity usually hovers in that 1.028 to 1.04. I'll put the exact one here, but in that territory. And when we talk about, I always like to think of what could I confuse this for. I might confuse this for maybe like an English bitter, because there is a lot of influence there. They are very similar styles. The malt is maybe a little too light here, but I could find an English bitter that fits in this territory. The characteristic of the hops should be a little bit different. This more on the peppery floral side, whereas the English bitter would be more on the floral, pungent, and like kind of citrus rind side. I would also expect to get a bit more like caramel malt characteristics from the English cousin. But I could see myself or someone else confusing that. I would also expect to get a little bit more of a English yeast characteristic, which would showcase itself as just a little bit more assertive with the fruity esters that I described. So that apple that I was like barely getting here, I would probably expect a little bit more of that, maybe even some like pear, apricot, sort of yeasty, fruity characteristics to come through. And that diacetyl could actually exist in the English bitter. It's not really typical, but it could exist. It wouldn't be a total anomaly for it to exist there. But the somewhat cleaner lager profile is definitely kind of a hallmark of this style. So other styles might confuse it with maybe a German Pilsner, but the German Pilsner tends to be a little bit more dry, a little bit more kind of sharp, whereas this can be kind of rounded on the mouthfeel. The German Pilsner tends to be a bit more kind of concise and dry, and the diacetyl wouldn't be allowed to be there, and the hop characteristics might be very similar, but they might showcase a little bit more floral on the German Pilsner than compared to here. What else might I confuse this for? You might confuse it for like maybe an American Pale Ale. I wouldn't confuse it with like the better examples, but I could see, when I say better examples, I basically like Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. That's for me. I'm very biased towards Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, or even, Ballast Point Grunion, for instance. But maybe you can compare it to like a brew pub version in the 1990s of an American Pale Ale. So I would say probably not a very good Pale Ale. But those might be some of those style comparisons. As far as the process for this beer, it's lager yeast, a must. It could just be Czech Pilsner malts, and then probably just a single hop, something like Saaz. And what else could we talk about? Food. So as far as food pairings, you're talking about a very light style, 3.5% for this example. So you want to make sure that you're not, you want to make sure that you're matching that with something that is going to fit. So, if I look, I always like to start with the if it grows together, it goes together thing. So, okay, if I picture myself in Prague and I'm in a, typical restaurant or pub sort of environment, what might I order? It would probably be something that's like a toast with some sort of spreads, either like a cheese spread or like a meat spread. Usually these meat spreads or like maybe accompanying sausages, things like that, are going to be on the more mild flavor side. So I wouldn't pair it with like a hot link sausage. I think the flavors would just kind of dominate too much. Maybe with like a Spanish chorizo, something that's just more on the paprika side of things, instead of like like a Mexican chorizo, which tends to be a lot more kind of spicy and greasy. I probably wouldn't try to match it with this because it might just be a little too intense. So really, gently cured, or gently seasoned cured meats and cheeses, things like brie or a Gruyere. And what else? Then I want to think, okay, probably a light salad. Pretty much any of the range of salads could work pretty well with this. Maybe like something that has like a white fish in there, nothing too fishy, because there is some bitterness here that will help kind of cleanse. It's like oils, but I do think like a salmon, for instance, would kind of dominate the palate on this and not quite work. I think it would work together in that it would refresh your palate, but I don't think it would help enhance the overall flavor experience. So then that might leave something like a fish taco could work pretty well. I think I always talk about fish tacos. I can eat a fish taco every day. And then maybe for dessert, maybe some like milk chocolate or white chocolate. Don't tend to go for white chocolate myself, but yeah, cheesecake. I always seem to mention cheesecakes also. But really even just like a nice piece of fruit with some honey or something like that could be a really nice dessert with this as well. And, I just thought about pizza. Maybe something like a margarita pizza or a little caprese salad could be good as well. So, okay, let's do a little recap here. We touched on food, we touched on a little bit of the history, we talked about the beer itself. Hit like and subscribe, please. And yeah, shoot me a comment, even if it's just to say hi. I think the algorithm likes it when folk interact. So yeah, do that, say hi. And that's it for now. Okay, cheers. Have a fantastic day. Thanks for watching. Take care.